Good evening. I'm speaking to you tonight to give you a report on the state of our nation's economy, and regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression. This is not the time for political fun and games. This is the time for a new beginning. I ask you now to put aside any feelings of frustration or helplessness about our political institutions and join me in this dramatic but responsible plan. In a few days, the Congress will stand at the fork of two roads. One road is all too familiar to us. It leads ultimately to higher taxes. The other road promises to renew the American spirit. It's a road of hope and opportunity. It places the direction of your life back in your hands where it belongs.
When Ronald Reagan took the oath of office as the 40th President of the United States, the country was experiencing some of its bleakest economic times since the Depression, along with high unemployment and stagflation, which is persistently high inflation, under the philosophy of Keynesian economics. On the campaign trail in 1980, Reagan announced his plan to fix the nation's economic mess. He claimed that exorbitant taxes, excessive government regulation, and massive social spending programs hampered growth. He proposed a phased 30% tax cut for the first 3 years of his presidency. Most of the cut would focus on the upper income levels. The media decided to creatively term these policies Reaganomics.
This represents $750 billion in tax cuts over the next 5 years. And this is only the beginning.
In this presentation, we will discover whether Reagan's domestic policies were truly beneficial to most Americans in both the short and long term. There were 4 pillars to Reaganomics: reducing federal spending, reducing government regulation, tightening the money supply to reduce inflation, and most importantly, cutting taxes. These weren't just any tax cuts. They were the largest set of tax cuts this country had ever seen at the time. Through all sorts of charts and graphs, Reagan explained to the entire country his across-the-board tax cut of 25% for all income brackets. Everyone got them. After months of selling his plan, Congress finally passed it, and Reagan signed it into law. And thus was born a new economic philosophy, Reaganomics. Reagan's tax plan cut the top tax rates for the wealthiest Americans from 70 to 50%. Why cut taxes so dramatically for the richest of the rich, while the entire country was mired in the middle of a recession?
More trickle-down economics.
Trickle-down economics. The idea of trickle-down economics is basically this. You cut tax rates for the richest Americans, therefore the richest Americans have more money in their pockets. Consequently, they would be able to spend and invest more in private enterprise, which would create new jobs. In other words, this wealth trickles down to everyone else in the economy. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? That was the plan. In some ways, Reaganomics was a spectacular success. It was an unprecedented victory for the richest people in the country, who benefited the most from Reagan's tax cuts. Let's take a look at this graph. According to the Economic Policy Institute, in 1980, the top 1% of Americans earned wages of about $110,000. By 1990, after 10 years of Reaganomics, the top 1% saw their wages rise by 80%. Was their wealth really trickling down? What's good for the rich should be good for all of us, correct? Let's see. Here's the average wages of the rest of the country in 1980, and then 1990. Here we can observe an enormous 3% increase in wages in these 10 years. Let's take a look at another graph. This is what family income growth looked like in the same 10-year span. The richest 1% of families, in red, had a pretty awesome decade, to say the least. Their family income skyrocketed by 74%. Everyone else? Let's just say that they were still waiting for the trickle. In fact, the poorest Americans saw their incomes shrink by 4.5%.
Today, downtown Chicago is getting ready for the Christmas shopping season, but the merchants in one neighborhood, Inglewood, expect little Christmas business this year. Most of their customers are on public aid, which has been cut by the Reagan administration. At Judge Barber's furniture store, pre-Christmas sales have not attracted shoppers, and Barber blames Reaganomics.
The customers that are coming in are certainly less than those that were coming in before the economics of Mr. Reagan's took place.
But some people elsewhere will be spending more this Christmas. At luxury stores like Neiman Marcus in Northbrook, Illinois, a wealthy suburb of Chicago, store manager Larry Gore predicts record sales, especially in jewelry and furs. Gore says his customers have more to spend this year because of the Reagan tax cuts.
At the end of 1989, after 8 years of Reaganomics, here's where the country stood. Income gap between richest and poorest biggest since 1947. That was the headline on UPI on December 30th, 1989. That month, Congress released a report on Reaganomics that concluded, quote, upper income Americans were the main direct beneficiaries of tax cuts in the early 1980s. There is no evidence in our data that those benefits have trickled down to lower income Americans. Aside from not trickling, the era of Reaganomics had another notable side effect. When President Reagan came into office in 1981, he inherited a $994 million national debt. But by the time he left, it was $2.6 billion. Reagan, a patron saint of fiscal conservatism, supposedly, grew the national debt by 186% during his 8 years in office. Recently, we were able to obtain some unedited footage of Reagan defending his economic policies. We will now play a few segments.
Before the New Deal, companies didn't have any regulation. Now with government intervention, we have to pay employees, negotiate with labor unions, care for our employees. If poor people don't want to be poor, they should work harder.
You mentioned the word we. Who's we exactly?
Sorry, I meant company.
So, your opposition has claimed that a lot of your policies negatively affected your base, the lower middle income families, and only benefited the rich, who arguably got us into the recession during your presidency. How do you respond?
The problem was the rich had too many regulations, which restricted their ability to fix the recession before it happened. Therefore, we should allow the rich to govern themselves. It's the best for the economy and for the American people.
Another key idea of Reaganomics was that government spending would be cut. As many of his critics predicted, that didn't happen. The government is always good at cutting taxes, but is never really good at cutting spending. Reagan did oversee cuts to some minor programs, but the really expensive items, such as Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, remain largely intact. And instead of cutting overall spending, it actually increased considerably because of Reagan's infatuation with defense spending, which saw the national debt triple. But you could say that the defense industry boomed under his presidency. Reagan insisted that the US was open to a window of vulnerability to the Soviet Union regarding nuclear defense. Massive government contracts were awarded to defense firms to upgrade the nation's military. Reagan even proposed a space-based missile defense system called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Many scientists just laughed at the feasibility of a laser-guided system that could shoot down enemy missiles. Along with those secret interview tapes we were able to uncover, we also found some unedited footage of Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative in action. Warning, viewer discretion is advised.
This is Admiral Radish of the Rebel Alliance. All squadron leaders report in.
Admiral, this is Blue Leader standing by.
This is Gold Leader standing by.
This is Red Leader standing by.
Sir, those are rebel ships. Get Admiral Gore immediately. Ready.
Truly remarkable. Now let us return to our exclusive interview.
The single greatest sin in modern history was the 75% tax rate on the rich that was introduced during the New Deal. The New Deal's effects were catastrophic. I already talked about how the excessive regulation strangled us, the economy. The tax rate introduced, however, was truly something abhorrent. It just de-incentivized the rich to taking risks and made them more willing to sit on their money without helping America, and crippled their ability to survive. So yes, I do want to help the rich, because when the rich benefit, everyone benefits. When the CEO of Macy's makes more money, all the employees make more money. When we, the rich, get more money, we put more money, the rich put more money into the company, which encourages people to work more.
Many members of your voting base occupy the lower middle class, benefiting from the social programs that you condemn. What do you have to say about that?
What people don't realize about the economy is that when you give people free food, money, and housing, then it makes everyone less willing to work, because it de-incentivizes them to work and teaches them that they can survive from doing nothing. The social programs are making poor people more lazy, because it helps them fund too much, which is why liberalism is a mental disease. Not to mention that the people who are lazy enough to sit on government programs, the welfare queens as I call them, are a massive drain on the US budget, and I am a firm believer in a small deficit. I cannot achieve that by letting these lazy dogs, less fortunate people, sit around on their government subsidies. Not to mention that they're probably using all of their money to buy crack. You have all of these uppity welfare queens milling about in their disgusting neighborhoods, buying and selling crack by the tons instead of feeding their family.
Mr. President, calm down, okay? Calm down. Alright, let's talk about the war on drugs, because many people argue that the war on drugs targets members of the African American communities.
Well, first of all, if you're stupid enough to get arrested, then I don't think that there is much off the table, we'll say, in terms of punishment. I think that torture, any kind of punishment should be on the table, suitable for the crime. And as far as the legality of it goes, the 13th Amendment does say that it is legal to enslave convicts. So, yeah.
So, you don't see any humanitarian problems to your policy?
Well, no, I don't see any humanitarian problems. I don't consider convicts to be, Could you do me a favor and not release these tapes, actually? Come to think of it. Yeah, don't release these.
The recording seems to have been abruptly shut off right there, for unspecified reasons. Nevertheless, that brings us to the infamous war on drugs.
Drugs are menacing our society.
The presidency of Ronald Reagan marked the start of a long period of skyrocketing rates of incarceration, largely thanks to his unprecedented expansion of the war on drugs. The number of people behind bars for non-violent drug offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. Public concern about illicit drug use built throughout the 1980s mainly because of the media's portrayal of people addicted to the smokable form of cocaine called crack. Soon after Reagan took office in 1981, his wife Nancy began a highly publicized anti-drug campaign called Just Say No. This set the stage for the zero-tolerance policies implemented in the mid to late 1980s. Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates, who believed that, quote, casual drug users should be taken out and shot, unquote, founded the DARE drug education program, which was quickly adopted nationwide despite the lack of evidence of its effectiveness.
A war, a shooting war, not in the Middle East right now. We have it on the streets of every major city in this country. And you know who's feeding and supporting the enemy? The casual drug user.
Gates created an elite paramilitary unit he called Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, CRASH. Gates launched military raids with names like Operation Hammer. In one weekend alone, nearly 1,500 people were rounded up and arrested. The increasingly harsh drug policies also blocked the expansion of syringe access programs and other harm reduction policies to reduce the rapid spread of HIV and AIDS, which Reagan's administration ignored for as long as it could. The war on drugs has produced profoundly unequal outcomes across racial groups, manifested through racial discrimination by law enforcement and disproportionate drug war misery suffered by communities of color. Nearly 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of people in state prisons for drug offenses are either Black or Latino. Reagan's drug policies have had long-standing effects. The number of Americans arrested for possession has tripled since 1980, reaching 1.3 million arrests per year in 2015, 6 times the number of arrests for drug sales. Overall, there were obviously some positives resulting from Reagan's domestic policies. He technically did deliver on each of his 4 major policy objectives, although not to the extent that he and his supporters had hoped. The annual increase in inflation-adjusted federal spending declined from 4% during the Carter administration to 2.5% during the Reagan administration, despite a record peacetime increase in real defense spending. This part of Reagan's fiscal record, however, reflected only a moderation, not the complete reversal that he had advertised, of prior fiscal trends. He made no significant changes to the major transfer payment programs such as Social Security and Medicare, and he proposed no substantial reductions in other domestic programs after his first budget. Federal spending technically did decrease as well, as it was 22.9% of gross domestic product, or GDP, in fiscal year 1981, and it declined to 22.1% of the GDP in fiscal year 1989. And the overall economy did grow, as well as the stock market. However, the problem is that the lower 99% of the nation did not benefit much from Reaganomics tax cuts, with some even losing great sums of money, as we outlined earlier. But for the largest income inequality since the government started tracking that sort of thing, and a skyrocketing national debt, thank you, Mr. Ronald Reagan.
And this is only the beginning.
Yes, Mr. Reagan, you were certainly right about that, at least. Trickle-down economics is far from gone. It's more than made a comeback.
What we've got to do is try as we may and see if we can deliver to make sure that tax rates don't go up on anybody. What we need is to get the entrepreneurs and investors back being willing to commit capital.
And how could we forget our friend Mike Pence?
Anybody that thinks that raising taxes on job creators is going to create jobs, I think is going to meet with an argument from me.
You can't have a healthy economy if you raise taxes on those that you expect to reinvest in the economy and to hire more people.
So you can't have a healthy economy unless you give special bonus tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires? If these people can't get tax cuts, no one else should get a tax cut? Today's conservatives prescribe Reaganomics to make America great again. President Donald J. Trump, Tea Party followers, and other Republicans advocate it as the solution that our economy needs today. Go ahead and watch it trickle down to everyone else. Just watch and see what happens.